But this morning's panel is a very good one to get the day started. We have two speakers. Most of you know who they are, but I will introduce them briefly in any case. To my immediate left is Wlad Godzich, who is a distinguished professor of literature at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and who is currently a visiting fellow in the Humanities Center for this term at Pitt. And at the far left is Stathis Gourgouris, who's visiting today from Columbia, where he's professor and chair, I believe, of classics.
No, not chair of classics. That will never happen.
Institute of, and he's the director of the Institute of Comparative Literature and Society at Columbia. Wlad Godzich's paper is called The Stateless and the Proper, and Stathis' paper is called The Epistemology of Edward Said, and I am not going to say more about that, so welcome.
Okay, so totally different. The first chapter of Edward Said's memoir, Out of Place, published in 1999, starts thus. All families invent their parents and children and give each of them a story, character, fate, and even a language. There was always something wrong with how I was invented and meant to fit in the world of my parents and four sisters. Whether this was because I constantly misread my part or because of some deep flaw in my being, I could not tell for most of my early life. Now, this extraordinary opening paragraph deserves to be included in anthologies featuring Augustine, Montaigne, and Rousseau. I could devote all of the time that has been imparted to me to a close reading and analysis of the masterful beginning, written by someone who knew more than a few things about beginnings. The echo of Anna Karenina, all families, etc., is a sly misdirection. Anna Karenina is not one of the palimpsestic texts of the memoir, but another work of Tolstoy's is. Tolstoy's own three-part memoir, fictionalized of course, entitled Childhood, Детство, of 1852, Boyhood, Otroczestwo, 1854, and Youth, Junost, 1856. This is the work that John Coetzee rewrote as his own autobiography under the titles Boyhood, Scenes from Provincial Life, and Youth, Scenes from Provincial Life, and Summertime, no scenes from provincial life. The latter without the misdirecting subtitle of the first two, Hiding the Dead to Tolstoy, behind an IOU issued to Balzac. Now, Said's own memoir could easily be shown to be imbued with Tolstoy's Boyhood, and more than a few references to Proust as well, especially La Recherche du Temps Perdu, with young Edward determining the left and right side of the 3-block-long road leading him to school in a manner that the young narrator of Swan's Way would immediately recognize. From the outset, the text acknowledges its provenance. It is the work of a reader, a well-read reader. And yet, the very first reference to reading in the third sentence does not speak of reading, but of misreading. And I remind you whether this was because I constantly misread my part. Now, is this a covert warning to the reader of the memoir? You think you are clever, you impertinent pedant, just because you see Tolstoy or Coetzee, but consider for a second that I, Edward Said, whose readings of canonical texts still command respect, I was constantly misreading. A little humility, as you inevitably misread my text. Now, the cautious reader will indeed heed this warning and reread the previous sentence. All families invent their parents and children, and a little later, there was always something wrong with how I was invented. Yes, we may grudgingly assent, some families may fabulate ancestors, and somewhat more rarely offspring. But surely to claim that all families do it is not only hyperbolic, but downright wrong, and therefore dangerously disqualifying in the opening sentence of a book that purports to be a truthful account of the author's early life. The repeated reminder that this author was referred to as a fibber by both of his parents in the next few pages is not reassuring on this score. The phrase, "there was always something wrong with how I was invented," seems designed to increase our unease. Under what circumstances can anyone say that there was always, and again, the absolute categorical, something wrong with how they were invented? Perhaps it could be found in one of those works of metafiction that we stopped reading 15 years ago, but again, not in a memoir. Now, the erudite reader, and readers of Said better be erudite if they do not want to experience firsthand a wrath worthy of Achilles, such a reader will realize that the verb invent, as used here, is not the same that the patent office monopolizes. Said's invent is the invent of inventio, the part of ancient rhetoric that deals with poien, that is, with conceptual and verbal creation, poetry in the noblest sense. As Cicero reminds his son in his famous epistle on the subject, De Inventione, Cicero makes clear that to invent in this sense is to find, and that an inventio is a find. The Provençal poets adopted this definition as the normative description of their art, trobar, to find in Old Provençal, leading to troubadour, to the finder, to designate the poet. Now, it should be obvious that the Provençal poets did not believe in creative writing. Creation was God's and creativity his. They were, as befits these masters of anticipatory anachronism, the disciples of Marcel Duchamp, the paradoxical inventor of the objet trouvé, the found object. Like Duchamp, who was an erudite reader of Cicero, they knew that poetic invention was the art of placing the newly found object in a setting that would transform its banality into an object of wonder. So the problematic sentence is now clearer. The young Edward is indeed a find, quote, meant to fit in the world of my parents and four sisters. The fact that he's older than his sisters no longer troubles the sentence. He's just a bad fit, or more idiomatically, a misfit. But that is precisely not what the next sentence says. It does not speak of a bad fit or of a misfit, but of a misreading. In fact, it offers a choice without a resolution. Whether this was because I constantly misread my part, or because of some deep flaw in my being, I could not tell for most of my early life. Now, the choice is quite odd. Either an ontological fault, a deep flaw in my being, or an error of reading. Once again, the reader may well wonder, in what possible world do we find, invent, choices between flawed being and misreading? A choice that implies an even more staggering one between being and reading, the very idea of which would fell Heidegger and have Socrates regret harassing poor Phaedrus. Now, lest we be tempted to convert this opposition into the more conventional one of being and appearance, by taking I constantly misread my part in a theatrical sense, or the sense of a performance, several pages later, Said recounts how he and his mother read Hamlet together in anticipation of a performance by John Gielgud in Cairo. They read from the same book, passing it back and forth among themselves, and each reading several different parts, all of them flawlessly, in spite of the logistics of the exchange and the presumed difficulty of finding one's lines at the appropriate moment. No, the young Edward did not misread theatrical parts. he just constantly misread his part. The pairing of this constant misreading with an ontological flaw begins to gain plausibility, though not clarity. The puzzled reader needs to pause at this juncture, even though this is only the third sentence of the first chapter. Its enigmatic choice must be understood, or else the rest of the memoir would be illegible. We would not know how to read it. Its regime of reading would render it opaque. This leads the reader to wonder about his own competence as a reader. Is the book in his hands opaque, or is it the reader who is opaque, who is flawed? And if the latter, what is his flaw? A form of illiteracy, presumably amenable to correction, or something more fundamental, perhaps even ontological. After all, a reader who cannot read is a deeply flawed indeed, almost a contradiction in terms, perhaps not quite a moron, but at least an oxymoron. The puzzle posed by these inaugural sentences can be stated as follows, once all the evidence in them is gone. Something went wrong with the invention of young Edward. This much seems clear. The reason the rest is not is because the easy equivalency between misreading and a flaw in being is not only not easy, but is not even an equivalency. Misreading belongs to the set of ascertainable activities, but a flaw of being can only be surmised. If there is a flaw in Edward's being, something must have gone wrong with his invention. But how would he know? Since he asserts that something did go wrong with his invention, then he must have some evidence of it, and the evidence cannot be anything but the constant misreading. So it turns out that the defect in invention and the deep flaw in being are in fact equivalent, and it is the constant misreading that stands alone. Now, the astute reader suddenly understands. The false equivalency is itself an instance of the very misreading that young Edward is constantly performing. The relieved reader regains her composure and feels ready to tackle the next sentence. But she is stopped by a sudden thought. What is this defect of invention that causes constant misreading? Or to put it in a slightly clearer but definitely puzzling way, who is it who misreads? A question that shifts the locus of the unknown in the better known question whether the subaltern can speak. Who is in the locus of the subaltern here? Who misreads constantly? The question presupposes that there is a theory of reading which vouches for who can read. But can such a theory explain why someone misreads constantly? Everyone can misread occasionally. Such events are trivial occurrences known as errors of reading. Suddenly, constant misreading begins to look like a feat, perhaps more difficult to achieve than constant, flawless reading, if there is such a thing. The young Edward begins to suspect that the problem lies in his identity, or rather in his inability to determine his identity. He focuses on the odd juxtaposition of his first and last name, but quickly moves on to a much more vexing problem of multiple, divided, competing identities. On page 5, I have retained this unsettled sense of many identities, mostly in conflict with each other, all of my life, together with an acute memory of the despairing feeling that I wish we could have been all Arab, or all European and American, or all Orthodox Christian, or all Muslim, or all Egyptian, and so on. The longing for a homogeneous, integrated identity, expressed by the all in this quotation, will always elude him, because, as he puts it, the total picture was never quite right. Whenever he attempted to put one together, whether by piecing together various family accounts or discovering that, quote, there never were the right number of well-functioning connectives between the parts I knew about or was able somehow to escalate. The choice of the term picture is not fortuitous. Young Edward's father was the proud owner and apparently relentless addict to an 8mm film camera he used to document his family's life. It was, Said writes, his father's way, quote, of capturing as well as confirming the ordered family domain he had created and now ruled, unquote. This is followed by a paragraph that belongs to the anthology of Augustine, Montaigne, and Rousseau I evoked earlier. Quote, I remember that as I grew older, certainly by age 11 or 12, I felt that the ritual of doing the same thing over and over in front of my father's camera was becoming more and more disconcerting. This awareness coincided with my wish somehow to be disembodied. One of my recurrent fantasies, the subject of a school essay I wrote when I was 12, was to be a book, whose fate I took to be happily free of unwelcome changes, distortions of its shape, criticism of its looks. Print for me was made up of a rare combination of expression in its style and contents, absolute rigidity, and integrity in its looks. Passed from hand to hand, place to place, time to time, I could remain my own true self. And there's a parenthesis that says as a book, and this parenthesis was obviously added at the moment of editing. Despite, and it continues, I could remain my own true self, despite being thrown out of a car and lost in a back drawer. Now, Augustine receives the divine command to open the book and read. Montaigne compiles a book from his voluminous readings, comprehensive readings. Rousseau takes one as an unopened companion on his reverie-filled promenades. Edward Said becomes a book. Now, it is of course the book's integrity and self-sameness that appeal to him. It is impervious to time and place, to exchange, even to being tossed out of a moving car. And those of you who know Edward know of his habits of tossing books with considerable violence, preferably at a wall, but that was only because he did not want to aim it at the person in front of him. Now, note that Edward, as book, is not the object of the caring ministrations of a gentle bibliophile. This book is handled and mishandled, never mind being read or misread. This is no library book. It is a book of and in the world, and yet somehow immune to this world. It is significant that his boyhood memory should be recalled in the context of the camera-mad father's ordered family domain he had created and now ruled. The evocation of Said's father as an ambiguous despot, generous but incommunicative, intimidating and imperious, expecting his only son to inherit the commercial empire he had erected and to manage it. Now, fortunately, this is a memoir, not fiction, for the reader would question the very similitude of this empire's dedication to all of the paraphernalia of writing, from pen to typewriter. Edward's father invented the first typing machine that could type Arabic. This despot rules over a realm governed by the law of repetition, from physical exercise to family excursions. The repetitions turn the young Edward into a Bergsonian automaton who has to disembody himself in order to preserve his sanity until he fantasizes his metamorphosis into a book. It is clear that the book here is the embodiment of resistance to despotic power. Whereas such power relies on the control of movement within defined spaces over determined length of time, the book ignores time and space, escapes the boundaries of the tyrannical realm, and survives exchange, brutality, and negligence. Most importantly, It remains true to itself, unaltered by its tribulations. Now, in the course of this discussion of identity and self-awareness, Edward Said advances a conception of the proper that warrants attention. Strictly speaking, it is not formulated as theory, but as an apparently random series of observations. One of the more interesting occurs in his description of his enthrallment with a girl playing Alice in his school's staging of Alice's adventures in Wonderland. What enthralls him is how this girl, a year older than Edward, who was then 9 years old, manages to be wholly herself during the ordinary school day and wholly Alice in the evening's performances. He examines, scrutinizes her, even spies on her as she leaves for home with her parents after the end of each of the 3 performances, hoping to catch a glimpse of the moment when she transitions from her Alice state to her everyday Micheline. Except for a fleeting glow in her eyes, there is no such moment. She is wholly the one and then wholly the other. She is never divided, partitioned between the two, unlike him who is constantly dealing with contending selves, none of which ever establishes itself in sovereign fashion. He realizes in somewhat confused fashion that whereas he indeed has several selves, all partials, she has none. She is Micheline, and then she is Alice. Her relationship to herself or selves is not one of ownership, but of mere being. He intuits that his understanding of what is proper to him derives from the notion of property that he has confusedly cobbled together from his father's discussion of his business properties and their management. Said, the author of the memoir, recalls, apparently gratuitously, that his father, as the sole representative of a number of brand names, referred to himself, in accordance with the practice of the time, as an agent. And he notes that the young Edward, whose Bildung we are following, deplored his absence of agency, his own absence of agency. Now, at this juncture, we can distinguish 3 distinct regimes of the proper. The proper is something one is, like Micheline or Alice. It is something that one has or owns, like young Edward and his father. And finally, it is something one can exclusively represent, like his businessman father. The first is the one we are all most familiar with, the proper as property, with the legal construction of property as developed in German jurisprudence under the term Eigentum, very much in the foreground. According to this doctrine, a property is something or someone that one can legally alienate, that is, render alien to oneself by an act of sale, for example. Young Edward is well versed in this version of the proper, since he feels alienated from the very selves that form his personality. The second, as exemplified by Micheline and Alice, is far less known, and its operations are mysterious. Nothing is alienated here, since one can go back to a previous proper without loss, but also without gain. This sort of proper is not subject to the laws of property. The third one looks like a hybrid. The laws of property are back in force, but manage to effect a passage from the state of ownership to the state of being, and thus to translate property into agency. The underlying mechanism of this operation is that of representation. Said Sr. does not own the Adler brand of typewriters or Let's stationery. He represents them, and he does so for gain and profit. Both the first and the third regime of the proper rest on the notion of property and on the legal framework that regulates the holding and the conveyance of property. The existence and maintenance of such a framework requires a functioning state, whether directly active or through colonial representation. Young Edward grasped this idea on several levels, especially after joining the Cub Scouts and facing his father's ire when the latter hears him rehearsing the Cub Scouts' oath of allegiance to God and King. Said Sr. reminds his son that he is not subject to any king since he is a US citizen. If he must take an oath, let it be to God and President. Young Edward, who has been attending British colonial schools for expats, knows who is king but has no idea who is President of the United States and what is the difference between a subject and a citizen. He learns from his father that a king may alienate a subject, and that subjects acting collectively can alienate a king, which is what brought the United States into being. A president may not alienate a citizen, at least until the Patriot Act, I guess. But citizens alienate presidents according to a set schedule of elections. What young Edward retains from this lesson in civics is that his father is a king, who can indeed alienate him, as he has threatened to do so on some occasions when the fibbing of his son has crossed some imaginary threshold. But let us return for a second to Micheline and her regime of the proper. As we saw, it does not obey any law and therefore has no need for any state. Hers is a regime of the proper, that is the regime of the stateless. And she indeed exists and lives in her own realm. In fact, this realm has its own language referred to as Cairo French, which is distinct, of course, from Alexandrian French, which together form Metropolitan French, and never mind whatever it is that people on the other side of the Mediterranean may speak. Now, the logic of the stateless is the logic that is actually developed in out of place, and it is not the logic of exile that we find in Said's other writings. And the logic of the stateless is preferred at this juncture because it is unsuitable for cosmopolitanism, since cosmopolitanism presupposes that one indeed belongs to a state. And so the question can now be stated: can the stateless read, or is the stateless condemned to misread? Young Edward and his constitutive flaw may very well be statelessness. It is his statelessness which motivates his rebellion against the regime of property, which invades him with partial occupations. Now, as you well know, the legal status of statelessness came into being following World War I, but was developed particularly after World War II through the signing, or I should say through the elaboration of several conventions, the most famous ones being those of 1961 and especially 1974, which the United States has not ratified. The object of these conventions was to reduce the number of people who were stateless. The conventions distinguished importantly between people who had a state and lost it, and were stateless in a sense of state loss, and those people who never had a state in the first instance. I, for example, was stateless in that sense. Because at the moment of my birth, my parents had lost and renounced their citizenships, respective citizenships, and the place where I was born had the Third Reich had just ceased to exist, and therefore I was stateless to the extent that there was not even anyone who could issue the proper papers certifying that I was born. Eventually, such papers were issued to me when I was 11 by an agency of the United Nations, and of course this was a totally fictional document with even the date of birth being chosen more to accommodate my father's desire that he and I share a similar birthday than any kind of facticity in this way. Which pleases me. So, the title of Said's memoir is Out of Place. Out of place is, of course, what happens to atoms in the atomic theory of Democritus. These atoms have being and they have movement. And their movement is designed to bring them back, not home, as frequently is misread, but to bring them to a place of rest. The stateless and its regime of the proper is linked to restlessness. And it is indeed what peace will mean for Said, especially in this book. Peace means rest. I will conclude this very, very quick exploration by contrasting his theory of reading and that of the deconstructionists, and particularly Deman at the same, who were active at the very same time. For Deman, reading has to be a practice of the improper. That is, it must in fact try to dislodge any regime of the proper, but understood as both the proper of Democritus and the proper of property. Whereas for Said, reading is a practice of the stateless proper. We have in Deman and the deconstructionist a form of reading that still deploys itself against the horizon of the state, whether present or absent, but certainly imposing a set of laws, mostly unwritten and unspoken, but determining what can be done. In that kind of a regime, Said can only misread. Thank
you. Thank you, Paul, for convening us here yet again, and thank you, Wlad, for a beautiful piece of writing. I'm in a very curious situation because for some time now, since I agreed to give a presentation in this context, I have been suffering from a sense of incapacity, which isn't usual for me. And I have been trying to think as to the reasons why. Paul will attest to the fact that I resisted vehemently the idea that I speak in this context. And I have been wondering at the let's say, dimensions of this resistance. Part of it is definitely, I think, a resistance to the commemoration. That itself is complicated because I have already participated as a host or an agent of the commemoration this year, given the anniversary year at various events at Columbia. But I also think it's definitely a resistance to commemoration, probably because of a part of a mourning process that over Edward Said's death, which is strangely ongoing. But there is, beyond that, thinking backwards now, a resistance on my part to speak about Edward Said that is gone way back. Since the times that I experienced the terror of speaking his presence about him, and also in the piece that I did finally write under for Boundary 2, quite a few years ago, which in fact he was in the very last year of his life and he had a chance to review. This piece I wrote under the relentless harassment of one Amir Mufti, who is not present in this room because of various tribulations in his hotel. So this is a very, I'm not being confessional here, there is a point that I'm been that's troubling, that I'm also in turn trying to trouble. Edward would actually use this word very often, to trouble something, an object of inquiry. And the question is, in fact, interestingly similar to the one that Wlad just raised so eloquently. And the question is, what does it mean to be a reader of Edward Said? In a sense, what I'm conveying rather clumsily is a sense of befuddlement at being a reader of Edward Said. This has to do, obviously, not with some sort of difficulty in his writing, because the performance of his writing is extraordinarily readable, and that is something that he was very proud of and practiced by careful design. The question is more, as a critic, how does one respond to a work that refuses, in some ways, to be theorized, refuses to be systematized, and troubles one's attempts to do so, even if, in fact, inevitably we do, either historically by creating an account of a certain trajectory, or polemically when oftentimes we're put in situations where we want to convey a kind of Saidian gesture against some other one. Parallel is not necessarily, perhaps not parallel, but inherent in this question is the other question that in some ways is reflected by this peculiar title I've given to this presentation. And that is the question of what might be the politics of knowledge that, or the modalities, before we get to politics, the modalities of knowledge that Edward Said's writing is engaged with. To use the title, the epistemology, I was thinking about that. I was thinking of what whenever I think about anything about him, I always think what he would think of what I'm thinking about. That's a curse, I can't get away from it. So I can imagine him laughing in his inimitable way, ironically, or perhaps even in that incredible gesture of befuddlement that I can invoke in my mind, about the notion of epistemology in relation to his name. And then I thought, it's true, I don't, what a word, not a word that would be associated with his writing. And yet, as I was reviewing a lot of his writing and attempting to put together an inquiry of this kind, I was amazed to find, I obviously had neglected it or had repressed it, that he uses the word quite often, more often than one thinks. And in fact, it is a concern. The epistemology of things is a great concern of his. It's not that it's absent from his thinking. But whatever might be delineated by epistemology in this case cannot be conducted, I think, as a theoretical exercise, let's say in the manner of a treatise, but more of in terms of a critical, empirical, interrogative exercise that I would argue privileges the realm of practice over theory. I understand that this can itself be a problematic phrase and deserves to be questioned. I'm not disavowing the importance of the dialectical relation between the two realms, but if in fact we want to, if in fact we understand dialectics not to be a neutral context of thinking, but one that it belongs to history and to locality, the relation between the two terms in which are linked dialectically can never be equal. It is always agonistically privileging one or the other. In this case, I think the practice would have to be privileged over theory, which is another dimension of why I'm experiencing this incapacity. I've decided to teach a course next semester called The Epistemology of Edward Said, which will be reading his writing from beginnings onward without any secondary material, just his writing, without any discussion of what has been written about him or what he's engaged with, in an attempt to, in an expressly pedagogical context, try to encounter the writing, in a kind of collective inquiry. And in a sense, I feel that I cannot tell you what might be the epistemology of Edward Said, if I can ever, before conducting this process. I can, however, give a list of things that I consider to be in some ways categorical, though that's, again, a dangerous word and has to be put in quotation marks. There is, of course, not only there is a method to Edward Said's criticism, but there is a rigorous method. And his methodology has all kinds of names or hues that are that he identifies. We have spoken already about affiliation. That would be a crucial one in his method. I'm not going to elaborate on that because we all know it. Another one that I find remarkably present and used very often is the term exfoliation, which is a wonderful image of what one might be the analytical process without the presumed mastery of either the subject that conducts the analysis or the object, which presumably can be exfoliated into infinity. The other one that we know a lot about that I'm not going to elaborate on, but is very important to me, is of course the notion of counterpoint, which he uses, of course, from his music criticism outward to discuss all kinds of issues. And the fourth one, no doubt there could be others that could be added, I'm not saying, is the notion of performance, which is extraordinarily crucial in his writing, and in many ways we might say that we actually have, if we're going to say anything about him as a thinker, we might say that he is a performative thinker. Yeah, one has to think about not just simply in the presence, which who knew him know what that means, but in terms of the writing itself. And the last book that he never finished, of course, Late Style, is the last attempt to come to terms with a specific kind of performativity in writing and in thinking. The second categorical dimension that I want to accentuate is the pedagogical one. Edward spoke often about the necessity of teaching and the fact that teaching was his his vocation in the profound sense that that word deserves, and that he often underlined. In this pedagogical situation, there are also certain crucial notions, certain crucial characteristics. The first one, which comes into being very early, is the notion of autodidacticism. For Said's thinking, the process of learning, not through a master, but by a kind of bizarre, paradoxical mode of inquiry, of self-learning. Paradoxical in what sense? To teach oneself something is sort of an oxymoron, because if you to teach anything presumes that you know something that you are teaching someone else, which is to say that yourself is the teacher. But if yourself is also the one who is learning, it presupposes that yourself does not know, and so this very strange kind of internal dialectics of teaching and learning without a master, where by virtue of self-learning one is not a master, one cannot be a master of yourself in an autodidactic situation. By this process, a certain kind of knowledge that's very, very different from systematic or theoretical knowledge is achieved. Next to that, and it links, I think, very directly, is the notion of another paradoxical notion of amateur virtuosity. We all remember the essay, the virtuoso is intellectual, which is, of course, the reflection on Glenn Gould. And a great number of essays that underline the notion of being an amateur, against, of course, increasingly against the professionalism of the academy. but also by drawing on in some ways, a pre-modern account of what it is to be an amateur, the one who is, in fact, in love with one's object, with one's practice. And the amateur element in his thinking does not mean that it is, or I should put it differently, the amateur element of his thinking can be just as well a virtuosic element. The two things can, in fact, coexist, so long as the virtuosic element does not become that of the expert or the professional who feels that he or she commands the field of inquiry entirely in advance. The other category, I'm saying things that everyone knows very well, but I'm trying to organize them in this relation. The other one is, of course, his implacable optimism, not as a person, which of course is obvious, but in his writing and in his thinking. And this optimism is, I think, linked to, again, the virtuosic amateur element. And it is also linked to this other characteristic of his, which was his skepticism. We have to try to think of them together. An optimistic skeptic is a very strange and paradoxical pair. I mean, he was very fond of quoting the thing that we all know belongs to Gramsci, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Although I discovered again in browsing through Edward's writing in the last couple of weeks that he attributes this to Romain Rolland, that Rolland is the one, not Gramsci. Gramsci borrows it from Rolland, according to Edward. I haven't had a chance to check this. But his skepticism is not the skepticism that leads to a kind of a critique that has no end, an endless negation, one that does not ultimately take positions, and so on and so forth. In that sense, it does need the optimism, the element of looking forward into the future at moments of the most extraordinary sense of incapacity or hopelessness. The essay on lost causes is a fascinating essay to read in this respect, where he delineates in ways that are more dramatic than any other context, if I may say so, the Palestinian situation in a context of the history of lost causes and what it means for an intellectual to be engaged knowingly in a lost cause, which of course by virtue of that does not become lost. That's how the essay ends. The last thing in this in the context of pedagogy, of course, is exile, about which I will not speak any further because we know what this means and it's likely to be discussed again. It was discussed yesterday. Now, I want to say something about the modalities. The reason why, in some ways, Edward Said is not a systematic thinker, which isn't to say that he's not consistent in his thinking. In fact, if one reads, I had this amazing experience some years ago reading the book of interviews that was published as a book from beginning to end, as one reads a novel. And I was these interviews are done in all kinds of different contexts. They are chronological. They're not meant to be read that way. But in reading them that way, I found something that would not have occurred to me otherwise, that there are remarkable prescient, I don't know what the word would be, prescient elements in the early interviews of things that became crucial, became much later. This isn't to say that he was aware as a grand planner of a certain trajectory, but it is to say that there is a remarkable consistency to his thinking that does not mean, however, that is systematicity. So in this non-systematic consistency is also evident in the different modalities of writing. Above all, Edward Said, we all know this, was an essayist. He was proud of that, and indulged in, if I may say so, in what he loved to remind us of, the famous Adorno quotation from his essay, the essay as form, of that the essay proceeds methodically, unmethodically. This is, of course, Adorno language, meaning it is methodical in its unmethodical procedure, right? I think this is characteristic of all of his writing, But the essay should not be confused with other forms, such as, of course, the journalistic writing that he did with a relentless commitment. In one of the recent commemoration, I witnessed, apart from the last interview, where he says something I had not noticed before. He speaks about the discipline of appearances, that he had to keep the discipline of appearances. This means the fact that he had, regardless of his whatever obstacles, including most importantly his ill health, that he had to keep appearing in public. That's what he means by appearances. The discipline of participating and in the public sphere. So journalism for him was that mode, a different kind of writing than the other writing. His music criticism, which I consider to be exceedingly important in his thinking, and I've spoken about this in other occasions, I won't elaborate on here, but I actually think his music criticism, again, as an amateur, as he always said, is as important in his overall thinking as it is for Adorno. The interview form, of which he was an extraordinary performer, as I suggested. The conversation, which was it's an oral form, but it is a form that inheres in his writing, in the sense that he recalls conversations. He actually conducts conversations in a conversational mode in his writing, and so on. The memoir, which Wlad so beautifully elaborated on, which it's not just his own memoir, but the memoir, or the mode of remembrance, is all over his writing. Not only his personal remembrance, but engagement with remembrances. Of course, the polemic, the review, and so on and so forth. These forms are all intertwined. I mean, I outline them separately because that's how language works. But actually, if we really look at his writing, we will see that he was fond of engaging them at the same time. How much time do I have? I would like to read, in order to demonstrate my incapacity further, I would like to read from some of Edward's works, because I think it's crucial. How much time do we have?
We have about 15 minutes until we need to stop. So we should leave 10 minutes for conversation.
Oh, more than 10 minutes for conversation. So I won't. I have selected a couple passages from this book, which is such a treasure, the Reflections on Exile, and very early essay on Cioran, where it's called, interestingly, Amateur of the Insoluble. Said speaks about the essay as a form. He's, of course, does it in other places. He says, along with only one other of the forms of writing, I think he's referring to poetry, although it's not clear. Along with only one other of the forms of writing, the essay can afford to make no concessions to narrative description. It has no image in mind but itself, and cannot afford to forsake what Hopkins called pitch, or utterly faithful accuracy in the interests of play. Montaigne comes to mind immediately, also Oscar Wilde. In the modern perspective, their essays are expatriations from things. Beautiful phrase with all kinds of resonances. Expatriations from things. As Wilde has one of his characters say, things exist only to be argued about. And explorations in a language whose written version surprises by its wit, invention, sheer novelty. Writing, in other words, that delights in the mere fact of its being written cleverly, as if by a child first learning to scratch words on a page, seeing them as pretty and strangely meaningful bursts of script that transgress the unrelieved blankness of the paper. I will comment on some things, but some things really don't deserve to be commented on. This one is from, I think, an incredibly important essay that in its day, of course, created quite a stir, the essay Opponents, Audiences, Constituencies, and Community, where the discussion of what an audience, or how one would deal with one's audience is dealt in a brilliant way, and it is one of the first instances of criticizing the professionalism of the academy. This, I think, is probably the more well-known of the things I will read. I specifically picked things that are not very well-known. He says, okay, if what I have been saying has any validity, then the politics of interpretation demands a dialectical response from a critical consciousness worthy of its name. Instead of non-interference and specialization, there must be interference, underlined, a crossing of borders and obstacles, a determined attempt to generalize exactly at those points where generalizations seem impossible to make. One of the first interferences to be ventured then is a crossing from literature, which is supposed to be subjective and powerless, into those exactly parallel realms now covered by journalism and the production of information that employ representation but are supposed to be objective and powerful. This calling to generalize at exactly the point where things are impossible to generalize, I take extremely seriously. As the risk of the kind of writing that aims to go beyond the self-enclosure into obviously the difficulties of the democratic life. The next I will read is from another classic essay, The Future of Criticism, where he delineates two types of criticism against each other. Interestingly enough, riffing from Benjamin's essay on Proust and Benjamin's own division between two types of literature in Benjamin's case. So he says, if these terms, Benjamin's terms, are shifted to the domain of criticism, it might be possible to say that the aim of some forms of criticism is to exemplify If these terms are shifted to the domain of criticism, it might be possible to say that the aim of some forms of criticism is to exemplify, do embody a certain kind of activity without in the least attempting to produce effects of disciplehood or doctrine in the reader. Quite clearly, Adorno's work is the most extreme form of this combination of distance and performance that we have. Like Proust, he points to things, but he does it so in the modes afforded him by negative dialectics, obsessively and it seems untiringly. Yet he cannot be paraphrased, nor in a sense can he be transmitted. The notion of an Adorno feast is quite laughable. This then is essayistic and algorithmic criticism, and insofar as its future effects are concerned, they are what can be called oppositional and secular. The second type of criticism is the equivalent of Peguy's touching mode, criticism that openly seeks the assent and identification with it of its readers. Most of the great critical systematizers are touchers. They want you to take what they have to offer and use it elsewhere, over and over again, preferably. Their work is codifiable and detachable. It travels in place and time, gaining or losing in strength and effectiveness according to situation, period, or practitioner. This is systematic criticism. If the form of the first kind is the essay, the form of this is the doctrine out of which books are made. I want to read also something that stunned me recently. I'm revisiting these things with great puzzlement. His essay about Foucault's death. It's very interesting how we were talking about the humanism, anti-humanism thing yesterday, and of course Foucault being the great sort of anti-humanist thinker. It's very interesting to see how Edward writes about Foucault here in light of that. He was neither simply a historian, a philosopher, nor a literary critic, but all of those things together, and then more still. Like Adorno, he was rigorous, uncompromising, and ascetic in his attitudes, although unlike Adorno, his obscurities had less to do with his style, which was brilliant, than with the grippingly large, often obscure, theoretical and imaginative suggestions about culture, society, and power toward which his entire oeuvre tended. In short, Foucault was a hybrid writer, depended on, but in his writing beyond, the genres of fiction, history, sociology, political science, or philosophy. He therefore imparts a certain deliberate extraterritoriality to his work, which is for that reason both Nietzschean and postmodern, ironic, skeptical, savage in its radicalism, comic and amoral in its overturning of orthodoxies, idols, and myths. Yet in Foucault's most impersonal prose, one can still hear a distinctive voice ringing through. It is not accidental that he was a master of the interview as a cultural form. I'll stop reading from it. This is, you can see how one can say Edward is speaking about himself in some ways, both here and in the previous passage I read. The last thing I will read, I would love to read more, is from a truly brilliant essay called The Quest for Gillo Pontecorvo. And I will read this in order for us to celebrate extraordinary writing. This essay is particularly interesting because it is an interview that Edward is conducting as the interviewer of Pontecorvo, and which is then turned into an essay form while sustaining the performative elements of the interview. But I will read from this sumptuous beginning, which is as sumptuous as the beginning of the memoir. A few months ago, on my way back from a trip to Egypt, I made a special detour to Rome to meet director Gillo Pontecorvo. Somewhat tentative in his response to my request for an interview, Pontecorvo nevertheless acceded, and we arranged to meet over Memorial Day weekend at his Rome apartment in Parioli, an elegant upper-middle-class quarter. He was trying to get his large and untidy-looking dog to relieve himself at the building entrance when I arrived in a driving rainstorm. Luckily, Pontecorvo had decided that the beast would not cooperate. Perhaps dog and master sensed my complete lack of enthusiasm for urban pets. So we entered his home forthwith. A smallish, compact man who doesn't look much over 55, Pontecorvo lives in a handsome but decidedly neither grand nor lavish apartment. The ambience is bourgeois, literate, calm, comfortable. It was a dark day, but no lights were on. Books lined one wall. His various and discolored prized plaques and statuettes were heaped unassumingly on a high shelf. Photographs, Brando was much in evidence, hung here and there. A vast collection of 18th century saints' pictures painted on glass adorned the available wall space. Both Pontecorvo and his flat, I saw no one else there during our discussion, are attractively unassertive, which is strange if one remembers the distinctive, often violent power of his films. He speaks a serviceable and occasionally even elegant French, though the accent and some of the words are strongly Italian, si for oui throughout, and the manner sedate but always charming and somehow elusive. His eyes are piercing blue, his ready smile diffident, his tone impatience consistently friendly, yet withdrawn. And the essay proceeds in exactly this fashion to account for what is an extraordinary, at times argumentative discussion over the significance of two films, Battle of Algiers and Burn, and Edward's agonizing pressure on Pontecorvo for why he's not, or has not, and he's not making a film about Palestinians. And there is a one point, to give you an idea of the kind of writing, where he's describing Pontecorvo responding to his thinking. And so he says, Pontecorvo began, and this is in quotations, what makes the situation there in Palestine more complicated and less clear than France and Algeria. And the quote ends, and then there's a dash, at which point I interrupted, saying, but it is clear to us. And then he goes on with the quotation. And I mean, this is an incredible performative writing in highly proper grammatical structure. of something that in fact is in what I would say in a kind of Brechtian sense, a gestic form. I will stop here.
I'm wondering if you both might think aloud a bit more about putting these two together, this element of performance that is so central to Said's writing and his reading, and sort of reading as performance. This comes out for me in many different places. To me, worlding the text in the essays, there's a performative element to the reading that comes out very strongly for me. And this question is motivated by a lot of recent writing and performance studies that moves away from thinking about the performance of a text in terms of loyalty, but actually the text as affording a certain performance that moves away from the loyalty to the text itself, if that makes any sense. So moving away from this idea of accuracy towards a text as enabling a performance beyond a question of the authority of the text.
I'll just jump in on this.
Yeah,
one of the things that Edward was always aware of is that the interpretation, or indeed the reading of a text, was always a contentious matter, and that therefore there was not one categorical way of reading something, even though he was passionate about his own reading and would defend it, in the most forceful manner. But being aware of this, you would often catch him when speaking, interrupting the flow of his own speech in order to actually give voice to the contending side. And so that the kind of thing that you were describing as his sense of the dialectic, it was there. So in fact, one got used to having to listen to him in stereo, in a sense, and with each ear being attuned to a different way of talking about the very same thing. And I think that that's what gave us the sense that this was a performance, because it actually took it away from the flatness of the page and gave it volume and gave it ambient. It made it ambient in that way. That's how I would approach this.
It's okay, because there are various hands actually.
First Bruce and then Don.
You both did such an incredibly beautiful and moving job of making Edward's voice live that it depressed me in the sense of making me want to also ask what you think of how alive he is within the contemporary practice of
Well, yeah, I mean,
Can I ask you the question?
not at all. I mean, the question, of course, has to be asked continuously, and I don't know if an answer, an equivocal answer, or again a kind of neutral, objective answer can be given. But there's one thing I can say is that the few years subsequent to his death, the immediate, like, I don't know what the number of years would be, what we saw was the kind of almost the glee with which his enemies registered their dismissal, and I think that has passed, and that we are now moving to another phase, which I don't know quite, how to characterize, but I think that it after I think there was a kind of a consensus in the academy, utterly bizarre to me, that Edward really wasn't a formidable thinker. He may have been an important personality, a good reader, or whatever, an activist or what have you, but that he was not a particularly grand thinker compared to a whole bunch of other names, which is, it's absurd, but it's truly absurd. And I think part of it has to do with his own his own way of rejecting that kind of grand thinker posture and about which both of us are trying to sort of tease out. That's a very hard thing it's a very hard thing to register in a professional world that seems to admire those kinds of declarative types of grand thinking, and so his significance will always be somewhat elusive, and like a great sort of literary writer, this would be discovered in engagements with the writing. I think we will continue to do that, provoke a lot of thinking, but that's the only way I can respond to a question I ask as well.
I would answer it very much in the same manner. I think the most telling thing is that it's almost inconceivable for anyone to write, the 99-page introduction to Said. The best introduction to Said is to just have people read it. But as a result, it's actually very difficult to even teach a class. I'm in awe of the fact that you're going to do it, because it has occurred to me on several occasions to do it, but I could not imagine really how I would carry this out, precisely because there are so many different facets and so on, and I would be called upon to somehow organize and structure them, and I don't think that that's actually useful.
Wlad, I think you movingly positioned Edward's project within a trope that reverses but also complicates Gayatri's can the stateless speak? And Stathis, you have produced in virtuoso style a sense of his desire to produce, as if it is the relation between writer and reader, a condition of extraterritoriality in which statelessness is the outcome of the relation. Mm-hmm. Has Edward, in the relation between your two wonderful discussions, generated a sense of a relation of extraterritorial being to extraterritorial being as a kind of ethics of reading?
I think he would have been very skeptical of the very expression ethics of reading.
I agree.
I think that he would acknowledge that this is something that we may want to ask, but he would always think that it should only be there as a question, that any attempt to answer it would be particularly fraught.
But both of you have emphasized responsibility in it. It is a powerful commitment. And if you don't codify the commitment by putting into question marks or quotation marks ethics, you in a sense consign his commitments and his responsibility to aleatory performances, which would in a sense render the former question not only motivated but also deserved. Does the question of ethics sustain him on a certain level?
It's a great, not only great question, but you're putting your finger on a problem that is symptomatic of his particular way of doing things. Because yes, I agree with Wlad. Ethics of reading is a term that he would just. Skeptical was rather mild, However, I'm thinking now the only way I can answer it as I'm listening to you, Don, is his peculiar position in terms of what the intellectual, what is the location of the intellectual, and an intellectual who is not actually above the fray. Because this is really, that's where it becomes a problem. In fact, actually in his mind, the intellectual cannot be above the fray. The moment that person's above the fray, it ceases to be intellectual. So we're talking about let's say a thinker or someone who's an actor, which has also the performative element, who is immersed in a situation and must be immersed in a situation where he or she must take positions There's an essay on that specifically. But who at the same time understands that these positions and the commitment to them is always subject not only to question, but to a kind of finitude. Because the intellectual must be cannot allow himself or herself to be in the service of a cause. This is one of the most incredible lessons that I've learned from him politically, because we know his commitment to the Palestinian cause, but his relentless resistance to being a spokesman or in the service of even this cause, which was for him of existential significance. So I think the word ethics is somewhat that he would disparage that notion entirely, but yes, there is that. I mean, and we'll have to, that's sends us to the very large discussion of the relation between politics and ethics, which we're obviously not going to do here. But I mean, that's what you're touching on.
I would just add two things to this, and then I agree entirely with this. There was nothing more that he dreaded than the idea that he could be the leader of a school.
Yes, exactly.
To turn that into something that, or to be imitated, was actually very frightening to him. And as a result, there is the temptation then to see what he's doing as singular. And it is singular, but
yes,
he is advocating that others be singular in their own way. And that's a very, very different kind of a proposition. So it is really about a position, and to that extent, yes, that has to do with ethics, but it is not about propositions.
Yeah, very well. Yeah, thank you.
Well, let me ask you to thank Wlad and Stathis for starting us off this morning.